She found a Lakota warrior dying in the snow. 3 days later, his tribe surrounded her cabin. Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched in the comments. Winter 1875 Dakota Territory. The sky was white and flat, like a lid clamped over the prairie. Not a bird moved, not a whisper of wind carried across the plain. The kind of cold that didn't bite, it clamped down hard and quiet. Martha Hamley stepped out of her cabin and shut the door behind her with a dull thud. The sound vanished into the snow-covered stillness. She was 31, a widow, no children. Her husband, Samuel Hamley, had died of lung fever nearly 2 years ago. They had come out here to start fresh, to raise chickens, plant rye, and maybe one day own cattle. What remained of that plan was a one-room log cabin, an unused barn that leaned a little too far west, and a worn path to the well. She hadn't left the homestead since November. There was nowhere to go, no one to see. Wrapped in a faded wool coat 2 sizes too big, Martha carried a wicker basket on her arm as she trudged through the packed snow. Her traps were set about 40 yards north, where a line of scrub trees broke the monotony of open ground. She didn't expect much. Maybe a rabbit, maybe nothing. Still, the habit kept her sane, gave the day shape. Each step crunched beneath her boots. The air pulled at her throat, dry and sharp. Her breath came slow and steady, but her shoulders were tense, always tense. That part never went away. Ever since Samuel passed, she'd lived with a low thrum of anxiety, like something might snap, though nothing ever did. But that morning, as she neared the tree line, something made her stop. She saw it from 15 feet away. A shape in the snow, not small, not like a fox or a coyote. A large figure, slumped, half-covered in drift. She froze, scanning the area, hand instinctively reaching into her coat pocket where her revolver rested. No movement, no tracks nearby. She stepped closer. It was a man. He lay on his side, one arm curled beneath him, the other stretched out over the snow as if he'd been crawling. His face was turned downward, but she could see frost clinging to the edges of his hair and the curve of his cheekbone. His clothes were torn and blood-stained. A buffalo hide coat hung off his frame like it had been ripped open. His skin was dark, brown olive in tone, and marked with old scars across his exposed shoulder. She dropped to her knees and placed 2 fingers under his jaw. There was a pulse. Weak, but there. Panic struck first, sharp and sudden. A Lakota? Or Cheyenne? What if he had a group nearby? What if this was some kind of trap? She stood and looked around again, heartbeat hammering in her throat. Nothing. Just snow and trees and dead silence. She could leave him, walk away, pretend she never saw him. The idea passed through her mind like an unwanted visitor, and she hated that it came at all. But there was no avoiding it. This man was dying, and she couldn't just watch him freeze to death. Whatever had happened to him, whoever he wasn't a threat right now. And if he'd wanted to harm someone, he wouldn't be lying here bleeding into the snow. She knelt again and reached for his shoulder. "Can you hear me?" she said, her voice flat and hoarse. No answer. She shook him gently. "I can't carry you unless you help." Still nothing. His eyes were shut, lips cracked and blue. She moved around and grabbed him under the arms, bracing herself. The first pull nearly knocked her over. He was heavy, taller than Samuel had been, and limp as a sack of wheat. She gritted her teeth and started dragging him, 1 foot after the other, inch by inch. Her gloves soaked through in minutes. She didn't stop. By the time she reached the cabin door, sweat clung cold to her back, and her arms trembled from the effort. She dragged him inside and kicked the door shut with her heel. The warmth hit like a wall. The fire in the hearth was still burning from the morning. She pulled the cot near it and laid him down, chest heaving. He was barely conscious, his eyelids fluttering but not opening. Blood had soaked into the side of his shirt. There was a hole just beneath his ribs. She didn't know what kind of bullet had hit him, but it was still bleeding, slow and steady. Martha moved with purpose. She peeled off her coat, rolled up her sleeves, and opened a tin box where she kept her husband's old medical supplies. She hadn't touched the sewing needles since the day Samuel died. Her hands shook as she cleaned the wound with boiling water and strips of cotton torn from bedsheet. She stitched carefully, Try not to think about the last time she'd done this. Try not to think at all. When it was over, she packed snow into a cloth and laid it on his head to bring down the fever she could already feel rising off him. She wrapped him in every spare blanket she owned and lit 2 oil lamps to keep the room warm. Then she sat down. She stared at him for a long time. The lines on his face were deep, carved by weather and hardship. He was probably near her age, maybe a little younger. She had no idea what had happened to him or why he'd ended up bleeding in her snow. But something in her chest felt tight, and not from fear. It was something closer to recognition. She didn't know this man, but she knew what it meant to be alone in the cold, waiting for someone to help. And she had helped. That had to count for something. She stayed awake most of that night. Every time he stirred or moaned, she checked his bandages. She kept the fire burning. When the dog whined from the porch, she let it in and laid it near the cot for warmth. The man didn't speak, didn't open his eyes, but he breathed. And for now, that was enough. Martha stirred from the chair some time after dawn, her neck stiff and knees sore from being folded too long. The fire had burned low, casting an amber glow across the floorboards. Outside, a pale sun had begun rising behind the cloud-thick horizon, turning the frost on the windows to silver streaks. She rubbed her eyes and looked toward the cot. He was still there, still breathing, but something was different. His head was turned slightly toward the door now, and his right hand had shifted, curled just barely at the edge of the blanket. She stood slowly, watching him, not wanting to startle. His eyes were open. They didn't blink. They just stared, black, steady, assessing. The gaze of a man who had come awake somewhere unfamiliar and was trying to decide whether he was safe or trapped. Martha kept her voice low, calm. "You've been here 2 days. I found you near the trees, bleeding. You got a bullet wound. I stitched it. You've been fevered." He said nothing, just kept watching. She stepped closer, stopping a few feet from the cot. "Can you understand me?" A long pause passed before he gave a single, shallow nod. His lips parted, dry and cracked, and when he spoke, the sound was hoarse, rasped, and deliberate. "My horse. Where?" Martha blinked. The question was unexpected. There was no horse. Just you, half covered in snow. "You'd have died if I hadn't pulled you in." He didn't react to that. Just blinked once, slow. "Water," he said. She moved immediately, pouring from the kettle into a tin cup. She knelt beside him and lifted his head slightly with one hand while she held the cup to his lips. He drank slow, shallow gulps, never taking his eyes off her. When he finished, he slumped back into the pillow, breathing heavier but more clearly than the day before. "I'm Martha Hanley. This is my land," she said after a while, voice steady but not unkind. "You can rest here until you're strong enough to move. I don't expect anything from you." Again, silence. Then, without looking at her, Tasunka Ska. She frowned slightly. "What?" "My name." He looked at her fully now. "White Horse." She nodded, committing it to memory. It suited him, though she didn't know why. "Do you know who shot you?" Another pause. His jaw tightened. "Settlers. I crossed the ridge too close. Didn't see them till it was too late." Martha lowered her eyes for a moment, fingers tightening around the edge of the cup. She'd heard of raids, of violence both ways. Folks in town always painted it in black and white. But out here, nothing was ever simple. She had no reason to doubt his words. No reason to trust them either. But the wound was real. The blood was real. And no one would fake frostbite to make a point. "You've got a fever still," she said, standing. "And you'll need food in you soon. I'll make broth." As she moved about the cabin, fetching water, stirring the small pot on the stove, she kept glancing at him. He didn't sleep, but he didn't speak either. Just watched her movements like a man studying a map he couldn't read. She noticed for the first time how thin he was. Not from injury, but from long-term strain. Cheekbones sharp under his skin, collarbones too prominent. A man who had been traveling hard for weeks. His hair was tangled, matted in places with blood, but beneath it was dignity, the kind that clung to people who had known structure, pride, war. She didn't know what kind of life he came from, but it hadn't been aimless. When the broth was ready, she brought it to him and fed it in slow spoonfuls. He took it without complaint, his gaze never wandering far. Halfway through, He stopped and asked a question that caught her off guard. You live alone? Martha set the bowl down. Yes. Why? She hesitated, unsure how much to tell. But the question wasn't loaded. It wasn't probing for weakness. It sounded like a man trying to understand something foreign to him. My husband died 2 winters ago. Lung fever. We came here for a new life. I stayed. He nodded once. You have family? Back east. A brother in St. Louis, but I haven't seen him in years. He wouldn't come even if I asked. White Horse didn't react. Just lay there quietly, like he understood what that kind of distance meant. She turned away to stoke the fire. Part of her expected to feel more unease than she did. There was a wounded man in her home, a stranger, a Lakota warrior whose people were, in many towns, still considered the enemy. But she didn't feel fear, not in the way she expected. There was caution, yes, but not fear, because he hadn't lied. He hadn't begged. He hadn't threatened. He had survived, and she had kept him breathing. That created something real. Not trust, not yet, but something that could grow in its place. Later that afternoon, she stepped outside to fetch more wood and saw that the snow had slowed to a soft, swirling dust. Her breath smoked in the air. She looked out toward the ridge, eyes scanning the distance. The thought hit her with a sudden clarity. If he had people looking for him, they'd come this way. If he was important, if he wasn't meant to be alone. She returned inside and shut the door firmly. I don't know if someone's coming for you, she said as she set the logs by the fire, not turning toward him. But if they do, I don't want blood on my land. I don't want guns pointed at this cabin. No one comes to kill, he said plainly. She looked at him. They'll come to see if I still breathe. That is all. She didn't ask how he could be sure. She didn't question whether he could truly guarantee peace if armed riders appeared. What she did was nod. Then you'd better keep breathing, she said, and walked past him to check the bandages. Outside, the sun began to fade, and a quiet settled over the prairie again. Deep, bone still. But inside the cabin, for the first time in over a year, the silence wasn't empty. It was shared. By the fourth morning, the fever had broken. The flush in White Horse's face had faded to a pale ash tone, and his breathing had steadied. Martha noticed the change as soon as she stepped into the cabin from a cold. He was sitting upright on the cot, one blanket wrapped loosely over his shoulders, legs draped over the side. He was still thin, still too weak to move far, but there was a grounded presence in him now, awake, aware, cautious. Martha paused at the door, holding a bundle of split firewood under one arm. He glanced at her, not startled, just watching. You shouldn't be sitting up yet, she said, not harshly. She shut the door with her boot and crossed the room. I feel my legs, he replied, voice low but firmer than before. I want to use them. She dropped the wood near the hearth, dusted snow from her sleeves, and straightened. You lost a lot of blood. You push too fast, you'll tear what I stitched. White Horse didn't argue, but he didn't lie back down either. I've seen worse, he said after a moment, more to himself than her. Martha didn't press further. She poured water into a tin basin and set it on the table near him. Washington careful not to wet the bandage. Then she added, more softly, if you need help, say so. He gave a single nod, then slowly dipped his hands into the water, jaw tightening from strain. Martha watched him out of the corner of her eye as she stoked the fire. His movements were deliberate, as though each one had to be measured against the pain in his side. But she noticed the discipline. He didn't flinch or complain, just endured. That day, he asked for more food. She boiled wild roots with dried meat and some cornmeal. He ate in silence, then asked, You trap? She nodded, surprised by the question. North of the trees. Mostly rabbits. Good. Snow's clean. No other scent. It was the first time she realized, really realized, that he wasn't just resting. He was observing, calculating. Recovering, yes, but also mapping his next steps. When the meal was done, Martha took the tin dishes to the wash basin. Her shoulders were tight, and not from physical work. Something lingered between them, not distrust exactly, but a suspended air of questions neither had asked. She turned to face him. You said your name is White Horse. Why were you traveling alone? He looked at her then, square in the eye. For a long moment, he didn't speak. My brother was killed, he said, 3 weeks ago. Whites opened fire on him near the river bend east of here. He was 16. Martha's expression didn't change, but something in her chest pulled tight. I followed their trail for 4 days. Lost it in the snow, then took a shot near the ridge. Woke up here. Was your brother armed? No, he shook his head once. He was fishing. Martha's mouth opened slightly, but she closed it again. The stories she'd heard from town didn't account for that. Their people talked about raids, about cattle stolen, wagons burned, not about boys with fishing lines getting gunned down. I'm sorry, she said. The words sounded small, but they were honest. He didn't thank her, just lowered his eyes, jaw tightening. Martha understood. Some pain didn't leave room for gratitude. Later, as the sun dipped low and the wind picked up again outside, she helped him stand. He leaned on her shoulder, more out of necessity than comfort, and she guided him to the chair near the hearth. It was the first time he'd moved from the cot since arriving. His breath came in short bursts, sweat breaking along his forehead from the effort, but he didn't complain. He just sat there, quietly staring into the fire. She went to the back wall and pulled a folded quilt from the chest. As she handed it to him, he looked up. "Why did you help me?" he asked. Martha paused, hands still gripping the blanket. "Because you were dying," she answered, as though it were obvious. But the words came slower after that. "Because no one should freeze alone out there. Not if someone can stop it." He nodded, almost imperceptibly. "I was afraid of you at first," she admitted, standing beside the chair. "Still am. A little, but not for the reason most people might be." He looked at her carefully. "Why then?" "Because you don't say much. And men who don't say much have usually seen more than they wanted to." He held her gaze a second longer, then turned back toward the fire. "I will not harm you," he said. "I owe you too much for that." She didn't answer. Didn't need to. That evening, as she tidied the shelves and stirred the stew, she noticed how different the room felt. Not lighter, not easier, but more balanced. Like the weight of grief didn't belong to her alone anymore. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from him. For a time, they said nothing. The only sound was the fire and the crack of wind outside the cabin walls. "Do you have people still looking for you?" she asked finally. He nodded once. "Yes, my tribe. They will not leave me behind. Will they come here? They may, if they find my trail, if they believe I still breathe." Martha folded her hands on the table. "Will they see me as a threat?" He studied her face, then shook his head. "No. If I am alive because of you, they will not bring war to your door." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "They're welcome," she said, and surprised herself by meaning it. "So long as there's no shooting." That night, Whitehorse slept in the chair by the fire, wrapped in the quilt. Martha left the cot empty. She didn't ask why he didn't want to lie down again. She suspected it had less to do with his side and more with facing the door. Just before dawn, he stirred. "Tomorrow," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I will walk outside." Martha, half awake in her own chair, nodded once and pulled her coat tighter. They would test the snow together, and whatever came next, they would face it side by side. The wind had eased by morning, leaving a stillness outside that felt like the pause between breaths. The sky was flat and gray, low-hanging, the kind that made you feel like snow might fall again before dusk. The cabin was quiet but warm, the fire holding steady from the night's burn. Martha moved slowly through her morning routine, checking the hearth, stirring the ashes, adding logs from the stacked pile. She didn't rush. She had nowhere to be, and for once, she wasn't entirely alone. Whitehorse stirred in the chair, stiff and slow, but awake. His blanket had slipped from one shoulder, and the fresh linen bandage Martha had wrapped around his torso showed just beneath his shirt. The swelling in his side had gone down. His color had returned. The deep purple bruising was now green around the edges. Still painful, but healing. Martha poured hot water into a basin, laid out clean cloth, and set a cup of coffee on the small table beside him. He reached for the cup without a word, sipped slowly, and nodded once in quiet thanks. After they ate, salted pork with cornmeal flatbread, Whitehorse reached for his coat. "You're not ready," Martha said, but her voice lacked conviction. He met her eyes. "I'll go slow." She didn't stop him, just helped him pull the coat over his shoulders and walked beside him as he made his way to the door. Every step was measured, his left hand gripping the doorframe for balance, jaw tight with effort. But he didn't stumble. Outside, the prairie stretched in every direction, bare, white, silent. The snow was hard-packed beneath a thin crust, not deep enough to sink into. He took one step onto the porch, then another. He closed his eyes for a second, as if listening. Then he looked toward the ridge beyond the tree line. Martha stepped beside him. "You recognize anything?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "I remember the trees. That's where I fell." She nodded slowly. "That's where I found you." He took another breath, then shifted his gaze toward the north. "If my people are coming, they'll come from that way." Martha followed his eyes. All she saw was the white blur of empty land. But she understood the weight of what he meant. "Will they come soon?" He was quiet, then said, "They won't stop looking." Martha studied his profile. There was something steadier in his face now. Not calm, but settled. A man who had accepted pain as part of his bones. She wondered about his brother. Had he buried him? Had there even been time? "You said you were tracking the men who shot your brother," she said, not pushing, just letting it hang. "I lost their trail in the blizzard. Too much wind, too much snow. No signs left. Will you go back after them?" He looked at her, then past her to the cabin. "I don't know yet." The words sat heavy between them. Martha didn't judge him. Vengeance was a fire that burned clean through a person, whether it brought justice or not. But she also saw something else in his answer, doubt. Weariness. A man unsure whether carrying hatred was worth the weight anymore. He stepped off the porch slowly, boots crunching against the snow, and walked about 15 feet out into the yard. Martha kept close, arms folded against the cold. She noticed him glancing toward the tree line every so often, his attention darting. Not nervous, but aware. Always aware. "How long were you traveling alone before you were shot?" she asked. "Since the day I buried my brother," he answered. "I left camp without telling anyone. I didn't want them to stop me. So they don't know what happened. They know he died. They don't know I went after the men who did it." Martha nodded, processing that. "If they find you here, and you're alive, what happens next?" White Horse breathed out slowly. "Then I answered to them. My elders will decide if I was right to leave without their word." She glanced at him. "You're not afraid of them?" "No, but I owe them truth." They stood there in silence, the cold air tightening around them. "Come inside," she said, "before you catch another fever." Back in the cabin, White Horse moved easier. He took the chair by the fire again, his breathing a little heavier, but his posture stronger. Martha went to the window and stared out toward the ridge. A part of her still expected to see movement, shadows against the snow, riders in the distance, but the land stayed quiet. Later that afternoon, Martha pulled out a small wooden box from beneath the bed. Inside were her husband's tools, a folding knife, a few nails, and the half-finished carving of a sparrow he'd been whittling the winter he died. She'd kept it, though she'd never known what for. Now, she set it on the table. White Horse noticed. "He made that." "Yes," she said, sitting across from him. He picked it up, turned it in his hand. It wasn't perfect, the wings uneven, the tail too long, but it was delicate, honest, the kind of thing made slowly, with intention. "You kept his things." Martha nodded. "I don't have much else." White Horse set the carving down gently. "You still speak of him like he's here." She met his gaze. "In some ways, he is, but he's not coming back. And I stopped waiting for him a long time ago." He seemed to understand that more than most would. He didn't ask anything else. That evening, as they ate in silence, Martha felt something shift. Not between them exactly, but in the space that connected them. The silence no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a room with no doors locked. A space neither had to explain yet, but both had permission to be inside. As night fell, the wind picked up again. Martha lit the oil lamp and checked the latch on the door. The dog barked once from the porch and then settled. White Horse stood slowly and walked to the window. He looked out across the snow with that same quiet focus. Then he said, not loud, not alarmed, just steady, "Something's coming." Martha joined him at the window. In the distance, far beyond the ridge, small black shapes moved against the white, low and steady. Riders. At least 4, maybe more. still too far to tell if they were friend or threat. She turned toward him. "Is it your people?" "I don't know," he said, but his expression was calm. Martha stepped back, her hand brushing against the rifle by the doorframe. She didn't reach for it yet. "They're not riding fast," he said. "They're not hunting." And something in his voice told her this was the moment everything would begin to change. The riders reached the ridge by mid-morning. 5 of them, distant but visible against the pale sky, lined up in silence like watchmen over the edge of the world. They didn't move forward. They didn't wave. They just stood there, their silhouettes still as pine trunks under snow. Martha watched from the window, her stomach knotted tight. She wasn't sure what she expected: shouts, weapons, a sudden charge, but the stillness was worse in some ways. The waiting, the not knowing. White Horse stood beside her, arms folded across his chest, his weight leaned gently against the wall. He hadn't spoken for several minutes, eyes locked on the horizon. Martha glanced at him. "Are they yours?" she asked. He gave the slightest nod. "Yes." She swallowed. "What happens now?" "They're waiting for me to show myself, to speak first." "Will they see me as a threat?" "No," he said firmly. "If I walk out on my own, they'll listen." Martha's hand hovered near the rifle leaning beside the door. She didn't touch it. Not yet. But the temptation sat heavy in her bones. Her father had warned her once, never stand bare when you don't know who's watching you from high ground. White Horse turned toward her. "You saved me. That's what they'll see." She nodded slowly, unsure whether to trust that. Not because she doubted him, but because trust, in her experience, didn't come free. Especially not out here. "I'll go," he said, moving to the door. "You're still recovering. What if they think you're weak?" His eyes were steady. "They'll think I'm alive. That's enough." He took Martha's winter coat, the one she'd let him borrow, and pulled it over his shoulders. He stepped onto the porch without another word, walked forward with careful, deliberate steps. His sides still ached. She could see in the way he moved, but he didn't falter. Martha stayed behind, door slightly ajar, eyes never leaving him. As White Horse reached the edge of the open field, about halfway to the ridge, one of the riders broke away and rode down slow. The others remained behind, watching. Martha squinted, hand tightening at her side. The rider approached White Horse and dismounted. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in furs. They spoke, too far for Martha to hear the words, but she watched their posture. No weapons drawn, no shouting, just steady, low conversation. Minutes passed. Then the rider turned his head and looked toward the cabin. Martha's breath caught. White Horse spoke again, slower this time, his hand gesturing once toward the cabin. The rider nodded. He didn't smile, but he didn't scowl either. Just reached forward and gripped White Horse's arm at the elbow. Firm, meaningful. Then he turned back toward his horse and mounted. When White Horse returned, his breath was heavier, but his eyes calm. "They'll come down slowly," he said. "They want to meet you." Martha stiffened. "Why?" "They want to see the woman who brought me back to life." The words landed heavier than he likely meant them to. She looked away, unsure what to say. By noon, the group had reached the flat below the ridge and approached on foot. 5 Lakota men, dressed in hides and fur-lined cloaks, their movements quiet and intentional. They left their horses tethered far behind, out of respect. Martha opened the door as they approached. Rifle still leaned by the frame, but untouched. White Horse stood beside her. The first man, older than the others, with deep-set eyes and white streaks in his braids, stepped forward. "I am Wakasa," he said in calm English, "elder to the Oglala." Martha nodded. "Martha Hanley. This is my home. You kept our brother alive," he said, when others would have left him. "I didn't know who he was," she replied. "I only knew he was bleeding in the snow." Wakasa looked at her for a moment longer, then nodded once. "That is enough." There was no ceremony, no dramatic speeches, just that, and yet it carried weight. White Horse stepped forward. "I left without permission," he told them. "I disobeyed. I will accept judgment." The elder nodded. "That is not for today." They entered the cabin, not all at once. Only 2 came inside, the others remaining outside as a sign of respect. Martha served water and bread. They didn't eat much, but they accepted it. Their eyes roamed the room, not intrusively, but with quiet curiosity. When they saw White Horse's bandages, they nodded with understanding. One of them, younger than the rest, spoke softly in Lakota. White Horse responded. Martha caught none of it, but noticed the rhythm, less tense than she expected. Familiar, comforting. Later, when the visitors stood to leave, Wikasa paused at the door. My people owe you no debt, he said plainly, but they do carry respect. Martha answered just as simply. That's all I ask. They left quietly, disappearing into the same direction they came from. No promises, no threats. That evening, as snow began to fall again, Martha and White Horse sat in silence, the fire between them. Outside, the land stretched on, still quiet, still dangerous in its own way, but less hostile than before. Martha finally asked the question that had lingered since morning. Will they take you back? White Horse stared into the fire. Yes, if I choose to go. And will you? He didn't answer right away. Then, not yet. She didn't push further. That night, as the fire burned low, the air between them held something that hadn't been there before. Not just shared survival, but mutual recognition. Two people who had both chosen to stay when leaving would have been easier. And out on the ridge, beneath the frozen stars, no one else came. The days that followed passed in a rhythm neither of them spoke about, but both accepted. Morning light through the frost-laced window woke them. Martha prepared coffee and oatmeal, while White Horse tended the fire. The dog, once wary, had started sleeping closer to White Horse's chair. Trust was unspoken in the cabin, like the steady beat of a clock you didn't notice until it stopped. Outside, the wind had calmed. Temperatures rose just enough to make the snow crusty and brittle underfoot. The quiet of the Dakota winter no longer felt suffocating. It felt manageable, familiar, like something they could work within. White Horse had regained most of his strength. He no longer winced when rising from the chair, and by midweek, he insisted on hauling the water from the well himself. Martha didn't argue, but she kept a close watch from the porch, arms crossed against the cold. You don't have to prove anything, she said as he dragged the heavy bucket up the final crank. I'm not proving, he answered. I'm living. That line stayed with her. By the end of the week, he'd repaired the shed door. Hinges tightened, frame reset, latch replaced. He did it without being asked. Martha came outside with an armful of firewood and found him working in the cold with his coat off, sleeves rolled to the elbows, breath puffing from his mouth in short bursts. You shouldn't be lifting, she said automatically. He didn't look up. I'm not lifting. I'm fixing. Martha shook her head. Stubborn. Alive, he said again. They ate together each evening, a small fire between them, usually in silence, sometimes with short exchanges. She found herself noticing his hands, the precision of how he cut meat, the way he folded cloth without waste. He noticed how she layered spices, how she used the same spoon her husband had carved without ever mentioning it. The air between them changed gradually, not softened, but less cautious. It became ordinary to move around each other, to pass tools, to share food. One morning, White Horse handed her a mended moccasin she didn't even realize he'd repaired. He'd stitched the sole with care, using her needle and his own thread. She didn't know how to thank him without making it heavy, so she simply said, "It fits better now." He nodded. It was coming apart, and that was the whole conversation. But it meant something. What remained unresolved, however, was her past, not just her grief. That, White Horse understood. But the life before that, before Samuel's death, before they moved west. She had spoken little of it, and he hadn't asked. Until one night, when the wind returned, howling against the walls like a beast pacing the trees. Martha sat by the window, hands folded, staring out at the dark. White Horse stood at the table, sharpening the small knife she kept in the drawer. The sound of metal on stone was steady, soft. She didn't look at him when she said, "There was someone before my husband." White Horse paused but said nothing. He was from Missouri, a ranch hand. He wasn't kind. Still, he stayed quiet. I left him, she said. Took only what I could carry. I didn't go to family. I didn't want them to know. I came west. Met Samuel a year later. She turned then, facing him. I never told Samuel about that man. I buried that part of me. White Horse met her gaze, calm and without pity. You don't owe anyone that story, he said. But if you tell it, let it be for yourself. She nodded. The tension in her chest loosened. Not because she was healed, but because she'd spoken. Because he hadn't turned away. The next morning, something shifted outside. Track's White Horse spotted them first, near the edge of the tree line. Fresh boot prints. Wide stride. Not one of his people. Someone had passed through during the night. Close, but not close enough to knock. Could be a trapper, Martha said, loading her rifle quietly. Could be worse, White Horse said. Could be someone who knows you live alone. She froze. No one's supposed to know I stayed out here. Someone might have followed the Lakota riders, he said. Curiosity makes poor men bold. They circled the property together, careful, scanning the snow. No sign of camp. No fire pit. Whoever passed through didn't linger. Could be a one-time wanderer, she said. White Horse didn't argue, but he placed the axe inside the cabin that night instead of the shed. That evening, the tension returned. Not between them, but around them. The feeling of being watched or nearly found. Martha stayed up later than usual, hands on her coffee cup, eyes flicking toward the windows. You ever been hunted? She asked. Yes, he said plainly. I never have. Not really. Not until now. You're not alone anymore, he said. The words struck her harder than she expected. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were true. And for the first time since Samuel's death, Martha believed it. 2 mornings later, they found the first sign that something was wrong. The barn door had been unlatched. It was subtle, just enough to catch Martha's attention as she stepped out into the snow with an armful of kindling. She always locked it after sundown, every night without fail. But now, the wood hung slightly ajar, the latch swinging freely in the wind. She stopped in her tracks, every muscle in her body tensing. Slowly, she turned back toward the cabin. White Horse, she called, her voice low but sharp. He was already coming out, coat halfway on, rifle in hand. I didn't leave it open, she said. He nodded once, scanning the horizon. The dog stood stiff beside the porch, ears forward, eyes fixed on the tree line. Nothing moved. No sound but the groaning wind. They checked the barn together. No animals, no food, no valuables, nothing taken. But someone had been inside. Tracks in straw. A boot heel, larger than either of theirs. Recent. He watched the cabin, White Horse said. Didn't come to steal. He came to see who lives here. Martha's jaw clenched. You think it's someone from town? Could be. Could be someone following a rumor. This land used to be empty. Now 2 people move in and out of a cabin all winter. It gets noticed. A new fear entered Martha's mind. What if it's him? White Horse looked at her. My first husband, she clarified. I never heard what happened to him. I ran. Changed my name. Samuel thought I left it all behind, but maybe... She didn't finish the thought. She didn't need to. White Horse didn't question her. He didn't offer false comfort. He simply said, if he returns, we'll know before he reaches the porch. That night, they took turns sleeping. One near the fire, one near the window. The rifle stayed loaded, resting across a chair. The tension was thick, but it was clean, focused. Not panic, but preparation. 3 days passed without incident. The snow softened under brief sunlight, then froze again by dusk. White Horse finished reinforcing the back door with spare planks and a crossbar. Martha double-checked every lock before bed. But on the 4th night, a knock came at the door. Not pounding, not urgent, just 2 hard raps, sharp enough to wake them both. White Horse stood slowly. Martha grabbed the rifle. He didn't open the door, just called out, who's there? A voice answered. Male. Familiar. Too familiar. Martha. She froze. The voice came again. It's me. Charles. She gripped the rifle tighter, hands slick with sudden sweat. Her breath caught in her chest. White Horse looked at her. His expression didn't change, but his stance shifted, alert, grounded. Charles. Her first husband. She hadn't heard that name in over 8 years. She never expected to again. Martha, I heard you were out here. The voice continued, a little louder now. Didn't believe it at first, but I saw the smoke. Figured you'd open the door for an old friend. She said nothing. Couldn't. White Horse stepped closer to the door, voice level. This land belongs to Martha Hanley. You are not welcome here. There was a pause, then a faint scoff. You let one of them speak for you now. White Horse's grip tightened, but he didn't move. Martha found her voice. Leave, Charles. You're not wanted. You ran, Martha. You stole from me. I took what I needed to survive, she snapped. You were mine. Not anymore. Silence hung thick on the other side of the door. Then, I'll be nearby. You'll come to your senses. Footsteps crunched in the snow, then faded. No gunfire. No shouting. Just retreat. White Horse waited another full minute before lowering the rifle. Martha still hadn't moved. Her face was pale, but her eyes were locked on the door. He's not finished, she said. No, White Horse agreed. Why now? After all these years? Because you built something, and he wants to break it. She swallowed hard. He'll come back. I know him. White Horse's voice was steady. Then we'll be ready. That night, she couldn't sleep. Not from fear, but from something else. A kind of sharp clarity. She wasn't the same woman who'd run barefoot across Missouri fields with a torn satchel and bruises on her back. She'd buried a husband, built a home, saved a man's life, and she wasn't going to be dragged backward by a ghost in boots. She walked outside before dawn, rifle over her shoulder. The sky was dark blue, nearly black, the first hint of sunrise far off. Her breath fogged in front of her face. White Horse joined her minutes later, quiet as always. He didn't ask questions. Together, they stood at the edge of the porch, watching the line of trees. She didn't say it out loud, but she knew now this was her home, and no man would take it from her again. The next 2 days passed with no knock, no voice in the dark, and no tracks near the cabin. But Martha didn't relax. Neither did White Horse. The silence wasn't peace. It was waiting, a kind of waiting that both of them had known before in different ways. Hers shaped by bruises and whispered threats, his by ambush and retreat. And now, those worlds had collided on the edge of a frozen prairie. White Horse spent most of the daylight hours outside, patrolling the perimeter. He moved like a man who expected company, but wasn't afraid of it. He reinforced the shed door again, reset the traps beyond the tree line, and cleared sight lines near the porch. He wasn't just fixing what was broken anymore. He was preparing for what might come. Martha kept the fire strong. She cooked, chopped wood, sharpened the knives. But she kept her ears open every minute. Every creak of wood in the cabin made her turn her head. Every gust of wind against the shutter made her flinch, just slightly. Fear didn't make her smaller now, but it made her sharper. That morning, White Horse returned with a fresh set of boot tracks heading west from the far edge of the property. He's circling, he said simply. How long before he gets bold again? She asked. He didn't answer. Martha walked back inside, pulled the rifle down from the hooks, and began cleaning it again. She had done it 3 times already that week. It wasn't about readiness anymore. It was about certainty. She wasn't going to be caught off guard. Not again. Not like before. Late that afternoon, they heard the horses. 2 of them. Riders approaching from the west trail, slow, deliberate. Not charging, not hiding. Just coming. White Horse stood near the window, body still. Not my people. Martha moved to the door, rifle across her chest. We meet them outside. Together, they stepped onto the porch. The wind had dropped to almost nothing. The air was brittle, the sky turning amber at the edges. The 2 riders came into view, both men, strangers. One had a gray duster and a wide black hat. The other wore a thick sheepskin coat and carried a rifle slung over his shoulder. Neither looked like trappers. Neither smiled. They stopped about 15 yards from a cabin. The man in the gray coat tipped his hat. Afternoon. Martha didn't lower her rifle. What do you want? We were just passing through, the man said. Looking for someone. Goes by Charles Rayburn. Said he might have headed this way. You seen him? Martha's stomach twisted. She didn't show it. Why are you looking for him? She asked. The other man spoke, voice lower. He owes a few folks back in Yankton. Money mostly. He also busted a man's jaw in a poker game last month. We're here to collect. White Horse said nothing, but he was watching their hands. I haven't seen him, Martha said, keeping her voice flat. The man in the gray coat nodded slowly, eyes shifting between her and White Horse. You sure? If I'd seen him, I'd remember, she said. Fair enough, the man said, pulling his reins slightly. But if he shows up, he's not just running from you. He tipped his hat again. You two take care. They turned their horses and rode off the way they came, their figures shrinking slowly into the pale orange light. Inside, Martha closed the door and locked it. Others are after him, she said. White Horse sat down, steady and calm. That changes nothing. He'll still come. But now we know he has enemies. That makes him sloppy. Martha paced once, then stopped. He won't ask nicely next time. He never really did. White Horse looked at her. Then we don't answer the door. That evening, Martha pulled out a box from under the floorboards, one she hadn't opened since Samuel died. Inside was a small pouch of coins, a folded letter never mailed, and a second revolver, old but clean. She handed it to White Horse. It was Samuel's. He wouldn't mind. He checked the chamber, nodded, and set it on the table. Martha exhaled and finally asked the question she'd avoided for days. What if he tries to burn the cabin? Then we wait in the snow, White Horse said. Then we rebuild. She looked at him carefully. Would you stay? After that, his answer came without hesitation. Yes. She didn't ask anything else that night. And when they sat across the fire, sharing bread in silence, there was something settled between them that hadn't been there before. Not hope exactly, but something like it. In the middle of the night, she woke to the sound of footsteps again, soft, slow, moving past the window. She didn't wake White Horse. She just sat up, rifle across her lap, and listened until the sound faded into the wind. By morning, the snow was clean again. No prints, no sign of fire. But she knew it was only a matter of time. And this time, she would not run. The air turned colder again that morning. The kind of cold that didn't move, it settled. Heavier. Still, even the dog seemed more alert, ears pricked toward the tree line, nose twitching as if it sensed something that hadn't yet made a sound. White Horse stood near the porch with his back to the rising sun, scanning the woods. He hadn't said much since the riders came looking for Charles. Neither had Martha. They didn't need to. They had reached a point beyond nervous talk. Now, they were preparing. She brought out coffee and a boiled potato wrapped in cloth. He nodded, took both, and ate in silence, crouched low near the snow-packed edge of the property where he'd cleared a shallow lookout the day before. The rifle lay across his knees, covered loosely with a piece of canvas. Martha had reinforced the shutters, packed extra food in a cloth sack by the door, and kept both revolvers loaded, one beside the window, the other strapped under the kitchen table. She'd grown up fearing men like Charles. But she wasn't that girl anymore. She wasn't hiding behind someone stronger. Now, she stood next to someone who understood that real strength meant staying. By midday, wind picked up again, brushing against the cabin's west wall. A faint sound carried through it, something unnatural. Horse hooves, slow and deliberate. Martha opened the window a crack. She saw him before he reached the clearing. Charles, alone. He rode a black gelding, head tilted down against the wind. Same heavy coat, same black hat pulled low. But his posture had changed. Less smug, more determined. He was armed, rifle slung across his back, revolver at his hip. He didn't stop until he was 15 feet from the cabin. Martha stepped outside. She didn't call for White Horse. He was already watching from the pines. Charles dismounted slowly. Martha, he said, as if no time had passed. You need to turn around, she said, voice flat. You're still cold, he said, glancing at the cabin. Still stubborn. She didn't answer. You really living out here with him? He nodded toward the trees. He's not your concern. Charles chuckled once. No, but you are. He took a slow step forward. She raised the rifle. Don't. He stopped. I didn't come to fight. Then you picked the wrong day. He looked at her, eyes narrowing. You belong with me. You always did. You just got soft. That husband of yours let you think you were in charge. Martha kept the barrel steady. That husband treated me like a person, something you never understood. You took something when you left. Gold. A horse. You owe me. I owe you nothing. Charles's jaw tensed. I didn't come alone last time, he said. I'll come back with others. I won't be here, she lied. You're not running this time? He asked. No, she said. But if you force me to shoot, I'll aim for the chest. Before Charles could respond, White Horse stepped out from the tree line, quiet, deliberate, his rifle leveled. Charles froze. Not because of the gun, but because of the calm in the man holding it. White Horse spoke once. You had your say. Charles looked between them. Something shifted in his expression, not fear, but understanding. He saw now. This wasn't Martha waiting to be saved. This was Martha choosing who stood beside her. You always were good at picking sides, he said. I just stopped picking wrong, she replied. Charles turned, mounted his horse, and backed away slowly. But as he passed the edge of the trees, he pulled the revolver from his hip and fired. The shot cracked through the wind. Martha ducked. White Horse fired once in return, clean, controlled. Charles jerked back in the saddle, dropped his weapon, and slumped forward. His horse kept moving. Not fast, just away. White Horse lowered the rifle. He's not dead, he said quietly, but he won't come back. Martha didn't move for a full minute. Then she exhaled, long, slow, and stepped back toward the cabin. Inside, she sank into the chair near the fire. White Horse followed, closed the door behind them, and placed the rifle on the wall. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Martha said, It's over, isn't it? White Horse nodded. Yes. Even if he sends someone else? He won't. He doesn't lead. He follows his own pain. And it's broken now. She looked at him. And yours. He met her gaze. Still here, but lighter. They sat together in silence as the light faded outside. No words. No ceremony. Only the sound of wood popping in the fire and the weight of something finally finished. And when Martha rose to stir the pot on the stove, White Horse stood beside her. Not to protect, but to stay.